go to work?
I'll mention it to Daryl.
Do you know how long that group has been organized? Has it been around for a while?
It's been around for a while, yes.
Well, do you think that women are surging into new levels of activism?
I think it depends on how you, sort of your standpoint. So if you've been around for a while, and I don't mean here, but and involved either in women's organizations or with women who are involved.
There was a time when I first came to Brattleboro, the 5 people on the select board, with the exception of one, owned 5 commercial properties here along Main Street. And the one exception was the husband of the owner who was on the select board.
That's what happens.
Yeah. And that has changed at this
That's
point?
changed. The select board's really, really changing, and I think Brattleboro is changing quite a bit, which is why we're here now. And so I think the select board's changed quite a bit. I'm concerned about whether it changes back, you know, because we probably all heard in high school history class that, you know, government is a necessary evil and that power corrupts. And what I've seen in the select board and in town government doesn't say that people start taking graft and, you know, bribes and subverting the contract process. What I see is that they get invested in their own power. And then after they're invested in their own power, they stop listening. I think we're quite organically shifting onto the subject of the...
Yes. So welcome to the Democracy Forum, which is not every Wednesday, but we try to schedule it as frequently as we have presenters. So this is, as you know, this is Kurt Daims.
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
Thank you.
He's going to be talking about the state of democracy in Brattleboro. Thank you all for coming.
So where were we?
The transition to
the
state of democracy.
Yeah.
So I'm just interested in your last comment. So how do you see, when you say that people become invested in their own power, what do you see as signs of that?
The 2 things come to mind. The NIMS resolution debate at the select board and the whole police fire project. These were egregious examples of abuse of power. During the, let me fill you in on the NIMS project. Yeah, exactly. It was publicized that it was warned. Everybody know what the warning is? It was warned as NIMS resolution. That's the end of the information. NIMS stands for National Incident Management System. And the legislation they would approve on June 2nd, 2012 was to sign on to this set of rules about managing an incident. Now, the NIMS system is corollary to the Homeland Security Administration's legislation on this and that and this and that, but it's basically a set of rules for transferring power to the federal emergency agencies when an incident is declared.
And what kind of, and who declares the incident?
It's after, you know, the more you read it, the less you know. You're familiar with this thing, and it's just exactly the kind of thing that Brattleboro had voted against on previous occasions. There was a select board, and I am getting back to your question. The select board had voted in 2003 for a resolution to not support surrender of police powers and the federal agencies' uses of local information such as the library records and so forth. They had voted specifically to not have this kind of thing happen, to not cooperate with the feds under things like the Patriot Act. While the Select Board in 2012, that's 9 years later, was not even interested in the text of that resolution when Dora Boubalis showed the apparent claim that there was an apparent conflict with previous resolutions. Instead, they voted for the NIMS resolution without reading it. That was 2012. Did I say June? I think it was July 12th, 2012. They met first on the 5th. A few of us objected to their not reading it. They came back. They admitted to not reading it. Dick DeGray admitted, I didn't read it. He was all set to vote for it. Mr. Chapman and Mr. Gartenstein plainly admitted not having read it, and they promised to read an outline over an intervening week of delay that we demanded. And they came back, and Mr. Chapman said, well, he read half of it, and it's his right to use his discretion and go ahead and vote for what the feds recommend. Now that, I thought, is an abuse of power. He could vote where he wants, but that's what you do as an individual. You vote wherever the hell you want as an individual. But when you're representing people, you don't first obscure the matter by not publicizing the content. They didn't even have a copy of the text of the resolution, of the legislation that the resolution refers to. And they maintained their right to not read it, even if they had a copy.
There was no response from the assemblage to this?
I was pretty pissed. 3 or 4 others were pretty pissed. Spoon Agave was there, he was pissed. And Howard Weiss Tisman said, hey, wait a minute, you didn't read it? And, but he didn't report on it. He didn't report on those details.
He didn't.
And
Has anybody talked about readdressing that, or is that just something that's always going to be?
I've tried a couple of times, and I'd like to start it again because now people can see where we're headed. Maybe they see a little bit more where we're headed.
Yeah. Wow, yeah.
The other issue that shows the abuse of power, along the prosecution is the wrong word, along the execution of the police fire project, there were many violations of procedure. On October 20th, maybe, 2012, the bond issue came up at a special representative town meeting, and the first 20 minutes were devoted to a presentation in favor of the construction. And you may know that at the beginning of every representative town meeting, there is a refresher course on the rules, which include a 2-minute limit on speech per turn, 2 minutes per turn, and nobody gets to speak more than once until everyone else has a chance. Well, one of the select board members spoke for 20 minutes and then passed the microphone to someone else who spoke for another 20
Who had
minutes.
the same thing to say.
The same thing to say, yeah. The
Is this
vote.
all about building, can I ask? Was
Yes.
this all about replacing the jail?
Replacing the police, adding on to the police department and the fire department.
Oh, not getting rid of the jail where they put people?
Replacing the-
Cells. That would
I
make-
think the jail was going to remain and an elevator was going to be added and the jail was going to be renovated. But anyway, disregarding the merits of the proposals, the the first 40 minutes was devoted to the proposals in favor. Several people objected. I rejected more than once. On my last turn objecting, I referred to the rules, and the moderator declared, "We don't operate or we don't play by Robert's rules, we play by our own rules."
And what are those?
His own rules, yeah.
Yeah, that's not really okay.
Yeah, I was shocked. I was so shocked, I really didn't know what to say, and I sat down. And people were laughing. A lot of people were laughing. They thought it was, hey, this is our power. We can flaunt it. So that whole program was pushed along many stages by such gross violations. So now that we have our new select board, we should be wary that they get in and they want to just be done with the stuff that is taking up their time.
We didn't even have a full slate of candidates.
You mean not enough candidates to fill positions? Yeah. Well, the select board's not been contested lately several times, right? Mr. Scholes was uncontested, and the one-year seat was contested with 4 candidates out of 3 seats.
Do write-ins this time.
Well, the select board's power in this case happens. It comes along because they work so hard, and they get tired. So they get tired, and they just want the thing to pass, right? The police fire project, boy, that was a lot of work. The representative town meeting congratulated itself for working so hard on it for 3 years. Well, the representative town meeting meets once a year. But they did a lot of patting on their back. They didn't want to have a laborious debate on it, and only the people did. It was not good for the people. So I could go on, but I think I'm trying to establish that when they get in power, I think it's just human nature. Unfortunately, you start to preserve your reputation, preserve the things you did. You develop a confirmation bias on all the work that you've put in. And that happened with the police fire project. Mr. Gartenstein, and he was the first to very smartly suggest it was not being properly executed at that meeting. He said we should not vote for this without having the money. And at the same time, a 1% option tax was being considered. Well, that was just a mess. And Mr. Gartenstein was the first to say, hey, let's not do this. We don't have the money. But a year later, and 2 years later, and 3 years later, he had to push it through. He just was stuck on it. Anyway, the select board gets into the question of initiatives and free speech, because around the state, select boards have considered their age-old status as the elders of the town to be immutable. When they see a petition, they think they have to vote on it. So over the past 10 years, when some 14 petitions have come to them for inclusion on the ballot, they don't see themselves performing administrative duty of assembling papers and contracting a printer. They see themselves up on the dais, proclaiming their blessing on the people's right to vote if it serves their purposes. And many times, not just in Brattleboro, but across the state, select boards have denied people's rights to vote on their articles which they petition for. Two main complaints, their justifications are that the article's subject is not town business or that it's frivolous. And if you can imagine, now these are people who work very hard. The select board job is a hard job. They don't want more complications, and they don't want the subjects to be widened. They like to deal in an old-fashioned parochial way with the curbs and the stop signs and the sewer districts and the water project and the school budget. That's the kinds of things that they like to do. Nowadays, people are taking a more creative and, should I say, a more expressive way to address town government. And they use town government to address bigger issues. The nuclear activists were particularly good at this.
Yes.
They've managed to pretty much crush nuclear power in the last 30 years without one piece of federal legislation.
I belong to the New England Coalition.
Mhm.
So the other day to do volunteer.
And you're in court a lot, right? You're doing things at the town level.
What they have is they have amazingly intelligent people who have been doing this for a long time, and they are committed to getting it out there and be transparent, because most of those companies are not transparent. So they're very lucky. I mean, that deal that's going on here is like they're watching everything they can because they have to. And the one thing that I can pass on to you, we had our annual meeting, and one of the gentlemen was saying he never eats any kind of seafood, anything in Pacific. We don't want to eat any fat that's been, in the Pacific Ocean. We have fish or anything else like that. It's all because she was still tremendously irradiated. All of that is. So it's a great organization. It's a frightening thing. And, most people are tired of listening to it. I'm sure they're tired. They just want it taken care of. They want it to be disassembled and taken care of. Well, if you want your children and their children to grow up healthy, it's not really advisable. Can I just mention one thing about, I was here when probably a lot of people were about to talk about how much it's going to cost for the jail to be redone, not having, the jail to be moved. Well, the chief of the people in charge invited the public to go down and look at the jails. And everybody that did it was spend the money, change the situation. You just couldn't. It was so dramatic. I don't know if you've seen them.
Yeah, I went to but let's get back to the.
Okay, sorry.
So I mentioned the nuclear power industry because the anti-nuke activists, because they act locally. And people had begun in the last, 20 years, 30 years to try to affect world issues and national issues locally. Brattleboro especially. There have been a number of resolutions across the state which are uniform resolutions. Earth Day, tar sands, what else? Abortion, environmental issues have all come up in efforts to, and nuclear power have come up in uniform writing at several or dozens of towns across the state all at once. Brattleboro does those. Brattleboro's missed a few, but done a number of them and signed on. And Brattleboro also does all sorts of other things. Brattleboro's treated the issue of prescription medicines, administrations of hospitals, I mean, technical things, somewhat dryish things in the 60s and 70s. And now in the last few decades, they're getting into more dirty issues. They're not dirty, what do I mean? Gritty. They're gritty issues. The war, the Patriot Act, and so forth, nuclear power. And the people on the select board don't want that kind of thing because they are in town government, like most town governments, I believe, longer-term residents of the community. They've been here for generations, and the liberals, and the progressive people with the more global attitudes, thinking globally, acting locally, they're new to town by comparison. They've been here for 20 years or 30 years, but not 3 or 4 generations. So people in town government have, their world here in Brattleboro is really shaken up. During the civil unions debate that went on for quite a while, and especially during the I think it was just then that there was a backlash, an attempt to change the state legislation for civil unions, and it was led rather euphemistically with a slogan, "Take Vermont back." Take back Vermont. So there is really a lot of antipathy between old and new Vermonters. Vermont really did change quickly. My wife, long-term resident of, and grew up in Massachusetts, says that when she was a kid, you made fun of Vermonters. You put a little bit of black wax on your lip or on your teeth to show you had missing teeth, and you said, "I'm from Vermont." And just showing, 40 years ago, Vermont was a conservative backwater, regarded around here, around New England, the way Pennsylvanians might regard Arkansas. So she says she's still in contact with those people. She works at the hospital, and I don't work at the hospital. I homeschool my kids, and I do political work, and I am in touch with a different kind of people. Those people are the poorer version of the ones that go on the select board. They don't like, understandably, they don't like the way their town has changed. And they don't want to say to their friends in other states, "Yeah, that's my town that passed that resolution, yeah." So when they see a resolution that says, we want to support, I don't know, what's the next thing that might happen in Brattleboro? Unisex bathrooms. They want to say, "No, this is frivolous. This doesn't have anything to do with town government. This is going to cause money to be spent that we don't need to spend." And so what do? They push the petition aside and deny the obvious course for the thing to be put on the ballot. That happened more and more in the 60s and 70s, according to my lawyer, Paul Gillies, who handles many of these cases for different towns. And it happened twice in my own experience here in Brattleboro. And the first time, I didn't have any idea. I just thought, oh, they denied it. And one of the attendees at the hearing where they refused to put it on the ballot said, and it was widely reported, that he accused the select board of trying to be the gatekeepers of public opinion. And Martha O'Connor, who was on the board at the time, said, yeah, we are, or we have to be the gatekeepers of public opinion. That comes naturally from their old-time attitude. And, Old English law, the selectmen were the wise people of, the wise guys of the town. And because they get in power, they start to feel that way. And they take prerogatives which aren't theirs legally. So,
I think that I've heard this certainly a lot. And I think there's a real issue with this narrative. Like, there's the people here, and they have a way of thinking, and then these newcomers come in, and they have a different way of thinking, and there's this big clash. And it's a very easy narrative, but life is a lot more complicated than that. I lived in Chelsea in central Vermont for 20 years, and it does not. The issues don't fall down on those kinds of lines. It is not that cut and dried. That, and the other point is that it happens, it's part of our society, because we live in a mobile society. So everywhere you live, a certain percentage of the population has moved there. That is the world that we are living in. Now, I'm not sure that it's helping our debate to try to stick with this narrative and say, there's people with these old attitudes and then there's people with new attitudes. I think we have to try to get beyond that, to try to look at what commonality we have. I'm not personally finding that narrative to be very useful.
okay. Well, instead of granting what you say, I'll say I'm only talking about Brattleboro. And there are two very particular reasons why the change amounts to more than there are some people here that have been here more than others. It's not just that. In 1967, there was a very radical legislation that was intended to preserve the farming industry.
At the state level?
At the state level. It restricted investment and mandated that the people selling a piece of land should pay a heavy tax, a punitive tax, if they resold it within 8 years or within 5 years or something. And this, along with other legislation that allowed very free interpretation of zoning laws, encouraged the development of 2 colleges around Brattleboro and the proliferation of communes because of the land use. And those 2 things, especially here in southeastern Vermont, made a much greater, more sudden change, especially the land use and the investment restrictions. That meant that farms were available for people to have communes on, and not for people to just flip over and sell. So it's not just your usual situation of, some people being around here are more conservative than newcomers. It's a really big change that really did happen, especially here in southern Vermont. And I like to talk to people and keep the debate open. My friends will tell you I have conservative friends, though I'm a radical. I teach religion, although I'm agnostic. I'm really looking around, and I agree with you that we have to talk to everybody, but we'll talk about that later. So for now, if I may, I'll just go with the proposition that there was a bit of antipathy between a restive population, a new restive population, and a parochial select board and a parochial representative town meeting. As Brattleboro became very active on social issues, the select board wanted to, not just in Brattleboro, but in other places, was also saying no to petitioned articles. In Royalton, there was one, an article to prevent the implementation of the requirement that parents be notified if a minor was to have, if their minor child was to have an abortion. And this was a kind of a messed up article. They asked, the petitioners asked that it be put on the ballot for a special town meeting. And the select board in Royalton said, no, that we don't have to do this. Well, they went to court and they lost. But the significance of the case was misinterpreted. It was lost, according to me, because of the requirement for the special town meeting. And that was, what's the emergency? They could wait to the next meeting, the next town meeting. But it was really asking for trouble to demand immediate vote. And the courts upheld the blocking by the select board. Until 2010, that decision was held as a affirmation of the select board's prerogative. And there were many more instances of petitions being denied by select boards. Comes 2010, now here in Brattleboro, lots of stuff happening. The pay-as-you-throw article, remember pay-as-you-throw? That came up for a vote twice at representative town meeting. The first time it was roundly defeated, and it was a real messy thing because the select board really wanted to save the money on the trash. I did a survey. I was in favor of it, but I couldn't find any of my neighbors to support it. It was really not, people were not happy about it. They wanted their free trash collection. A year later, it came up again, and with quite a bit of arm twisting, it was passed. There was some procedural maneuvering at the representative town meeting, and boy, that went all day. And I was glad for it being passed because it amounted to some progress on the environmental issue. But I was not happy with the arm twisting, and I supported a referendum. Does everybody know what the referendum is? In Brattleboro, I should mention, Brattleboro uses those words differently. The referendum is a revote on an issue by the people. So the RTM is our little part-time legislature. They voted for it, and I supported the referendum because I wanted it to be decided by the people, and I was kind of torn about it because I thought it was pretty good, but people were really angry about it. They got to vote for it, but they had a petition, and the select board tried to block the petition. Legal action ensued, and they had to put it to a vote of the people, and they finally came around, and they got it through a couple years later. But it was a mess. In 2010, later that year, I fronted another kind of anti-nuclear resolution. This was to ask the state legislature to study a certain legal theory to close Vermont Yankee. The select board said, no, that's none of our business. Even though we pay, our attorney to attend the meetings of I forget which commission, and even though we pay for the sirens around town, even though we have money and time and people invested in this issue, officially, one of them said, we don't have to put this on the ballot. We took them to court, and we won. And we established that if the signatures are there, it's not for the government, the town select board, to say, we don't like this.
Who is we in the we took them? Who is we took them to court?
I was and our attorney, Paul Gillis. And so we prevailed in court, and there was a very decisive rebuke to the select board. So was the pay-as-you-throw referendum, which rebuked the select board, and the this about the anti-nuclear provision, the anti-nuclear petition, and then a year or two later, there was a referendum on the budget, which the select board proposed in order to support the police fire project. So within 3 years, there were 3 serious rebukes to the select board. And they were really dug in. And it wouldn't even have to be a matter of age and generations, but with that kind of history, the people were making inroads into town government, and as one of the select board people put it, interfering. The people were interfering in town government, and it was really kind of annoying to them.
Just as a newcomer, did it have an impact on the people who subsequently ran for the select board for the election? In other words, did this propel a change in the political climate in that way?
I think it's a good possibility. There are a lot of other things been happening that might account for the change. The representative town meeting also has changed in composition. I've been on that body for 9 years, and it's mostly people that look like me. And now there's some pigment there. There's some people with pigment in their hair and a couple people with pigment in their skin. It's very unusual. And some change of attitude, too. I think Mr. Trump has a lot to do with that. I think he's inspired people to be active. And a number of other things that have happened around Brattleboro have really stirred things up to get the representative town meeting to be more representative. Now, about how the initiative process has changed, it's a mixed blessing. We have this right here in Brattleboro that we've used, and in several cases it's comprised, or rather a rebuff to the town government, not just the select board, but the representative town meeting as well. Following those 3 court cases, or there's 2 court cases and the other one settled out of court, the select board and the representative town meeting passed amendments to the town charter which restricted the rights of the people to bring petitions. Everybody knows now around Brattleboro, if you want to bring a petition, you have to do it at a certain time. You want to do it at a certain time because it'll only get voted on March town meeting day. Was everybody aware of that? Before 2011, it could be voted any day of the year. So 365ths of your power to bring a note of public sentiment to a vote is gone. 365ths of it is gone now. The timing is crucial. In 2015, there was a contentious budget debate, and several people around, lots of people I'm sure, wanted a decision based on the sentiments of the people. One of the select board members, I think it was Mr. Scholes, said that there's no way to know what the people think. Well, you could put it to their vote. You could put it to a vote. Did you think of that? No. He said there's no way to know what the people think. People came to me and others in my organization and said, well, come on, let's get it on the ballot. It was against the law at that point. We could not put it on the ballot because March 2nd or March 3rd, March had passed, the next vote was going to be 11 months later, when we could have had a chance to vote on this thing which was important at that day. And that's because of the legislation which said, sorry, you can only put things to a vote on on the second Tuesday in March. It's not actually the second Tuesday, it's the second, it's the 10 days after, anyway, it's early March. So while we have these rights and we're famous for them, we're backsliding. There was also an effort, along with that other change, to restrict the rights of people to have a referendum. And it was a rather confused meeting. The legislation had allowed for a referendum within 10 days with 5% of the people signing, and they changed it to 5 days with 10% of the people signing, or something like that. It ended up a wash, but they tried to restrict that, and they couldn't. They did also restrict the rights of people to start an ordinance being non-advisory, a law, effectively a local law. It had previously been, it's pretty hard, never happened in Brattleboro that anyone passed a petition for an ordinance. 10% of the people need to sign the petition. And it could be on the books, on the ballot any time of year. Well, now it can still be on the ballot any time of year, but after you get your petition, and after it's put to the select board to put it on the ballot, it goes first to the representative town meeting. So and they decide whether you can vote for it. So it's a crazy extra step, but what it obviously is meant to do is make sure that the government thinks it's okay. Now, these are listed in, these two powers of initiative and referendum power are listed in the Article 3 of our charter, which is labeled Powers of the People. Obviously, this is intended to be a power of the people. And I ask you, what kind of power of the people is it if you first have to ask them, the government, for a right to vote on it? That was a gross evisceration of the people's petition power. So while we have this great reputation for being progressive and using our civil rights and our petition powers, they have been eviscerated from our charter. Other towns around Vermont can do their advisory resolutions 365 days a year. I think there's some tiny restriction on it. In Massachusetts, Amherst, for instance, guess how many signatures they need? 10. 10 to put something on the ballot. 100, or is it 50 if you want a special meeting, and 200 if you want some other kind of special thing. So, with all the toppings, it's 200. And that's in a town of much greater population than Brattleboro. In Brattleboro, to make another comparison, if you want to be on the representative town meeting, you need 10 signatures to put your name on the ballot. 10 to put your name on the ballot. If you want to be on the select board, you need 30. Now, why do we have this 10%, which used to be 20? I think it used to be 20. But anyways, now it's 10% to make an ordinance. That would be, at the very least, 840, 870 signatures. And if you want an advisory resolution, that's right now it's around 430, 5% of the voting populace. Why would it be based on the voting populace? Well, it seems like an obvious thing, but it's not based on the voting populace. It's based on the voter registrations. The actual people who vote are, at last count, I think, as low as 8% of the registered voters. In Burlington, your signature requirement is based on the number of people who voted in the previous election. That's reasonable, because you want to base it on active voters, not on people who may have moved out of town 14 years ago. So this question of restriction of rights is very much up in the air, if you ask me. The rights of the people to vote are not restricted, but the rights of us to decide what we vote about are really going out the window. Then there's a matter of what happens to resolutions that do succeed in coming to a vote. That's a mixed bag, too. We recently succeeded, that is, the people of Brattleboro recently succeeded in declaring Indigenous Peoples' Day. But several of the other recent resolutions are just ignored. As a matter of fact, the Select Board has done a very much a washed-out version of the plastic bag ban. If you talk to Tim Maciel, who brought the proposition, it's really not what he had in mind. It's really a weak proposition, not a leading proposition. It's rather washed out. And I mentioned to you earlier the NIMS resolution should have been enjoined by the previous action, the previous vote. So many of these are, I think, becoming ultimate acts. That is, people in Brattleboro and I think around the country have been suffering the repressive and entrenched attitudes of government, local and national, so that they have come to think of the freedom of speech with, with piety, because it's the only thing they can do. It is, in many cases, the ultimate thing that they can do. And when they make resolutions distinct from the way we make New Year's resolutions, with the intent of action, when they make these resolutions with the intent of just setting themselves apart or putting an issue out there. Putting the issue out there isn't okay if it's really the first time. But people have come to think of their freedom of speech as the last thing they do. And I think that's a bad thing. You have my attitudes now. My version of history is a little bit dry here for Brattleboro, but I am passionately, very seriously engaged for the sake of the world and for the sake of my children. I want them to have a place where they can do things, where they have a handle on their future through government. And I still think Brattleboro can do that. I think Brattleboro is a bunch of people, many of them creatively engaged in government as self-expression. And it's got to go farther than self-expression, but I think we've got a good start on it.
you.